It was a creed written into the founding documents that declared the destiny of a nation. Yes, we can. It was whispered by slaves and abolitionists as they blazed the trail toward freedom. Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
It was sung
by immigrants as they struck out the distant shores, pioneers who pushed westward against unforgiving wilderness. Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
It was the call of workers organized, women who reached for the ballots, a president who chose the moon as our new frontier,
and a king who took us to the mountaintop and pointed the way to the promised land.
Yes, we can to justice and equality.
This is Boston Red. Another update here from us to the listeners at iHeart. President Obama gave a long-ranging interview to Thomas Friedman, a journalist, a commentator, and author with the New York Times, summing up the world's events and his philosophy on the conducting of foreign policy primarily. He talked about the U.S. involvement in the world, specifically in the Asian theater, where China sets, the South China Seas, etc., and nations there, and how the U.S. was using its trade interests there to expand other types of relationships. Nations do this. However, the Chinese have had a long history of not involving themselves in the internal affairs of other nations. That has not been part of what they do. And with one or two carriers at this point militarily, it's not part of that. Their military is maturing by the day, and as they build more and more ships, etc., etc. But the Chinese are well aware, as any prudent nation is, that there is a limit to expansionism via the military sector. In 2014, it's all about trade. In fact, Tom Friedman wrote a book about the world is flat. Basically, what he meant by that was trade relations top everything else. The U.S., however, is saddled, and President Obama more or less alludes to this, my words, not his, with the Wilsonian foreign policy of the racist Woodrow Wilson. That was at a different time in history. That was what normally would refer to as a more of a cowboy history. Going into the Roaring Twenties, etc., there were little skirmishes basically there, but the only actual war they had, we're not counting World War I. World War I was a different kind of war, a war that took millions of lives. That's where mustard gas was used. My grandfather was in that war, and it was not pretty in the marsh, the mud of France. But as we move to the Second War, or what they call the Great War, World War II, commonly referred to in the U.S., was an entire mobilization against a regime gone mad, state capitalism at its worst. Hitler called it Nazism. The idea of not only eliminating certain peoples, i.e. Romas, Christians, communists, all of Africa could get there, and the Nazis were in parts of Africa, what the Western nations call North Africa. They were there, Algiers, etc. You can just ask Rommel, Patton chased him across and out of North Africa. But North Africa is very close, as Libya to Italy. And of course Patton rolled his tanks out of there and eventually on to Italy. But that was a different type of Europe. Hitler had most of his was horse-drawn carriages. It was not fully mechanized. The same situation in the early 80s. Parts of the Chinese army were drawn literally by the cannons by horses. They've come a long ways in 30 years on the military and also on the economic plane. The president in his interview talks about knowledge and how knowledge is accumulated. And knowledge is not exactly at parity now, but it's coming very, very close. One of the things I noticed with a bit of note, him talking about university systems and the American university systems. I would disagree with him as far as quote-unquote knowledge, scientific knowledge. The American universities, in some instances, are a little bit ahead, and in most instances, a little bit behind. China is now getting into education business and will start to exploit their university systems worldwide. You have the Europeans with a different type of university system. Is set up more for quote-unquote knowledge gathering. The U.S. University system has basically not set up more mass education, catering to business, giving basic skills after high school to people, and some would go on to graduate school. But the problem there with a lot of the research in the U.S., it's done in the confines of the IBMs of the world, in laboratories that are devoted to medical products for profits. And even the universities, a lot of the research there is sponsored by various corporations, which is a little bit different type of situation. And also at the same time, it limits what technologies can be put out. But in 2014, we see more and more technologies coming from more and more parts of the earth. For example, Cuba is a pioneer in the manufacture of various drugs. In fact, they have a drug there. It's on the boycott here, but it will assist diabetics in not having their toes removed. So in other words, if you have a basic education, basic technology, the scientific know-how, progress can be made, and it comes out of all quarters of the world. And that is where the U.S. stands in terms of its system. And when we look at our systems in places like Texas, that's ruled over by Texas Perry and his rock, that's cut education back, that's cut back something called a common core, in other words, basic common things that would be taught. And in places like the very red state of Oklahoma, where they are eliminating the common core, but they don't have a core. And these kinds of things have stifled education. When you have courses in high school that are ahistorical with the American history. I'm not talking about world history and geography and other things. Students learn very little about that. That is one of the reasons in the U.S. Americans don't pay a lot of attention to foreign policy. And President Obama talked about that. He also talked about the American body politic being polarized. He called that the maximalists. In other words, people that are believers in that particular ideology. Now, he was talking about Americans not being ideological. Well, America has been ideological, but in a different sense than most people of the world would look at it. He touched upon Libya and their parties there. Libya, as with many African countries, have what quote-unquote what they call one-party states. But one-party states can be as democratic as, say, in the U.S. with 2 or 3 parties. The U.S. virtually does not have operable third parties. Eventually, third-party candidates get elected, but you have basically the 2 parties, and as he points out correctly, ideologically, they are basically to the center, not that far apart. With the exception of the Republican Party has went that way. It's become much more ideological, and we've talked about that, the party of Pat Buchanan. But that is primarily based on race. Last night on our program, or this morning actually, the Monday Morning Quarterback, we talked about what happened outside of St. Louis, Missouri, in a place called Ferguson, where an African-American teenager, 17 years old, was brutally killed. And these things are happening with more, as one would say, regularity across the U.S. We had Eric Garner in New York. The chokehold applied to him, and it's becoming that these homicides are weighing up with other types of gun violence. So that is ingrained in the American psyche. That is ideological. It's called white supremacy. And when you have this type of city, at about 20,000, majority of the people there were African American, and the police force, majority of those people were white. And these are the things that you face up against. Now in Iraq, he basically said, well, the U.S. would be there with drones and airplanes for indefinite period of time. The problem there is there's no stable political system there. They have some parties, but in effect they really don't have parties. They do have a parliamentary system, but it's not working. El-Maliki, the prime minister, is wanting to run for a third term. The other people in his own coalition are not very happy about that, so he has special forces royal to him, literally encircling certain places where the Iraqi governmental offices is, including the green zone area. So that type of situation doesn't work out. President Obama also pointed out regrets in the Libyan thing as part of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, as President Putin correctly pointed out, is like they had these various colored revolutions in the old Soviet Union. The purple one today, the gray one tomorrow, the green one the next day. And effectively they were just shuffling the chairs on the deck is what has happened in Ukraine. They had a so-called evolution there, appointed a government there in Ukraine, and now that government was overthrown with a center-right government, and they call it democracy. The Communist Party in Ukraine has been outlawed, but the same thing going back to Libya. Libya, Colonel Gaddafi had a regime there, was stable. He had his highway system, electoral system, etc., was in very good shape. Now, the president said, well, his military could not have stood up against the Islamicists. Well, the whole problem there is whether it could or it could not. He had a military system, but he was not basically in the military business. He had went to Chad and several other places, but they did not have a strong military, and there was absolutely no reason for that. As far as these other gangs that are operating around there, they don't operate in a vacuum. The same gangs that are now in Iraq were in Libya. They've changed their names and all over the place. And many of those people, components of them, have been trained by the Western CIA and by the Mossad and by various other foreign intelligence service, as what happened in Benghazi with the killing of Ambassador Stevens, an Arabic speaker. So in other words, we see these things happening all around. It's not very as simplistic. But the right wing in this country would say, well, we should do more. The question I put to them is, when you interfere in Afghanistan or in Kabul or in Baghdad and put troops there, lose lives, trillions of dollars, how long do you plan on staying? Well, they'll say, well, we have to stay till we're ready. Well, we're ready. What does ready mean? 1 year, 5 years, 20 years, you'll never be ready, because you cannot implant your idea of a political system there. The political system in this country is in a, as one would say, stagnation for the most part. That's why the government shut down. You don't do that in a modern democracy. You don't shut the government down because of something like the deficit. And you have that type of politics, as he said, extremely polarized politics, extreme money politics. We also covered here the election out in Hawaii, where that is right now on a place called Puma, one of the what they call the Big Island. They had 2 tornadoes there. The island was knocked out. They have several thousand people. We don't know. We've seen several numbers, 8,000 to 6,000. We'd say more like about 4,000 or 5,000 registered voters there. So the candidates, Schatz is one. He was appointed by the governor, who was ousted in a landslide. A long political connected person with President Obama. In fact, he saw baby Obama in his baby crib. Abercrombie is 74 years old, so the president is, 53? So obviously he was there. He lost out. He'd appointed Schatz. The senator long-standing there, Daniel Inouye, died in office. He wanted to appoint Colleen Halabuskas, but that was not honored. So now they'll literally be going door to door out in that area where 2 precincts are out. They must be very large ones, because the 2 that had voted had roughly 600 to 700 voters in them each. So that was not very many. So the bulk must be in the other part. And also the candidate Hibiscus was outspent more than 2-1, and the machinery in Hawaii was open to shots. Shots, I think it's 41. She's in her 60s. So the what we'll be looking at there is a grassroots campaign taken on to financial campaign, and we'll see where that goes. But like Ms. Halabuska said Saturday night, that in many cases money does matter, and in this case, no doubt about it, money does matter. The person that ousted Abercrombie used a grassroots campaign. It is used. President Obama used a grassroots campaign. But there's also, he had to raise $1 billion to get reelected. Plus, so we're seeing more and more the entrance of money in this polarization. He called it the maximalist. And there's an economic reason for all this. We now have Republican candidates that are telling people they should buy their contraceptives over counter after Hobby Lobby. So in other words, the employer doesn't provide that on the medical insurance. The person has to buy it out of their pocket, which is no substitute at all. But that is the situation that you get when you run what we call the Pat Buchanan Republican Party. That is the Republican Party. We did another program on Watergate. You can check that out over on Blog Talk, and Richard Nixon and social media, etc. All those things there. Social media was in the so-called Arab Spring, but that can be contrived also. So be very, very careful about that. We'll go now on to President Obama, and as he sat for a long, almost an hour interview with Thomas Friedman. Good day, and we shall talk to you soon.
Present at right now. Do you feel present at the disintegration? What is it? What do you think's going on out there that accounts for so many states seemingly collapsing, and the kind of level of disorder that we're seeing?
Well, first of all, I think you can't generalize across the globe, because there are a bunch of places where good news keeps on coming. Asia continues to grow, and I think not only is it growing, but you're starting to see democracies in places like Indonesia solidify, and that's a huge part of the global population. I think that the trend lines in Latin America are good. Central America, we've got some real problems. So overall, I think that there's still cause for optimism. But I do believe that what we're seeing in the Middle East in particular, and parts of North Africa, is an order that dates back to World War I, starting to buckle under a variety of different strains. And you've written about this some. Part of what you see is the Cold War gone, and the proxy battle between the West and the Soviet system propped up a lot of governments that weren't very strong. What was left then were a series of authoritarian regimes that weren't producing the kind of economic growth and civic and political hope that allowed it to sustain themselves. You combine that with globalization, technology, all the forces we're familiar with, and the Arab Spring was going to come sometime. You didn't know what spark it was going to be, but now what you have is an end of the old order, but a very rocky path to this new order being built. And one way to characterize it is you've got old autocratic systems. You have new systems, but no civic traditions there. No economic framework that can sustain itself. And so the populism all gets channeled into some very negative ways, particularly around extremist ideologies and fundamentalist ideologies that have no chance of delivering for the people in these countries in the 21st century, but are simple organizing principles that allow people to recruit and gravitate towards them. And it's a very dangerous time for that reason in the Middle East and North Africa and parts of the Muslim world. The other trend that you see is because in part, great power competition is lessened. The United States militarily is so dominant, and the likelihood of a face-to-face standoff between the big countries has been reduced, partly because of global economic integration. What you see are a lot of regional contests between those of us, like the United States, who believe in an international set of rules, some rules for the road that can underwrite joint prosperity, and a more traditional view of spheres of influence and wanting to, the big countries wanting to muscle the little countries and to gain advantages with respect to trade or with respect to maritime rules, what have you. And that's a broader contest as well. And those things, I think, are merging. Our goal should be to help usher in a new order in places like the Middle East and North Africa, but also to recommit countries to the broader project of setting up a series of international rules and norms that can serve everyone. But that is a big, long-term, challenging project, and when you compound it with the pressures of things like climate change, it's not surprising that right now, at least, what you're seeing is a lot of chaos in various places.
How do you react when you hear in our debate, well, had only President Obama armed the Syrian rebels, had only we kept 10,000 people behind in Iraq, this disorder never would have emerged?
Yeah, well, part of it is just to look at the facts. With respect to Iraq, my predecessor, regardless of what you thought about the original decision to invade, I think through the heroic efforts of our military was able to pass on to the Iraqis a democratic system and a sovereign state. That democratic system and sovereign state, for reasons of politics that would be familiar to any politician here in the United States, decided it wasn't good politics to sign an agreement that would allow the United States troops to stay there.
In the middle of the Arab Spring.
In the middle of the Arab Spring. And the notion that somehow we could force them to do that ran contrary to the very objective that the Bush administration had laid out, which was Iraqis are going to make their own decisions. They squandered an opportunity, and I've been, I think, pretty clear about the fact that had the Shia majority seized the opportunity to reach out to the Sunnis and the Kurds in a more effective way past legislation like de-Baathification, that would have made a difference. I don't think that's can be disputed. The flip side of it is, if they had done exactly what they did, and we had had 10,000 troops there, that would not have prevented the kinds of problems that we've seen anyway. The difference would be we'd have 10,000 troops in the middle of this chaos as opposed to having a much more limited number. With respect to Syria, it's always been a fantasy, this idea that we could provide some light arms or even more sophisticated arms to what was essentially an opposition made up of former doctors, farmers, pharmacists, and so forth, and that they were going to be able to battle not only a well-armed state, but also a well-armed state backed by Russia, backed by Iran, a battle-hardened Hezbollah. That was never in the cards. And so I think that...
Are you finding that now because you're trying to arm people, find people? What are we finding?
There's not as much capacity as you would hope.
Yeah.
The truth is that one advantage that countries like Iran have in this region is they've been playing the proxy game for a long time, and they've made heavy investments. Mm-hmm. They're not constrained by Congress. They're not constrained by basic norms or international law or budgets. And so, if you have a 30-year ramp to build up a fighting force like Hezbollah, that can be somewhat effective. But what I think the broader point we need to stay focused on is what we have is a disaffected Sunni minority in the case of Iraq, majority in the case of Syria, stretching from essentially Baghdad to Damascus, or in that region in between. And unless we can give them a formula that speaks to the aspirations of that population, we are inevitably going to have problems. And Assad hasn't learned that lesson. Unfortunately, there was a period of time where the Shia majority in Iraq, I think, didn't fully understand that. They're starting to understand it now. Unfortunately, we now have ISIL, which has, I think, very little appeal to ordinary Sunnis. On the other hand, they're filling a vacuum, and the question for us has to be not simply how we counteract them militarily, but how are we going to speak to a Sunni majority in that area, a Sunni majority or a Sunni population in that area, a Sunni population elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa that right now is detached from the global economy, feels no stake in it, doesn't see any prospects for themselves. That's a dangerous situation, and it's going to require a whole of government effort, not just our military, but our diplomacy, our economic and social and cultural and civic power, and we've got to stitch together coalitions. And that's going to be our main task over the next several years.
How close are we in Iraq to getting the kind of government there that at least could give us a platform to intervene in ways that are non-military? Is Maliki staying? Is he going? Are they?
I think we're. I'm more optimistic about it than I might have been if you had asked me the question a month ago. Oh. They've now elected a president. They've elected a Speaker of the House. The final step is to elect a prime minister and allow that prime minister to form a government. They're close. It has been encouraging to see key figures in the Shia Iraqi population recognizing that they have to make accommodations in order to hold the country together. When you have as important a person as the Grand Ayatollah Sistani stating that a government has to abide by a constitution and also recognize the diverse interests of the country, that helps.
Have the Iranians been helpful? I mean,
well, I think what the Iranians have done is to finally realize that a maximalist position by the Shias inside of Iraq is over the long term going to fail. And that's, by the way, a broader lesson for every country. If you want just 100%, and the notion is that the winner really does take all the spoils, sooner or later that government is going to break down. Sooner or later the society breaks down when you have very sharp sectarian or ethnic divisions. So I think we have a chance to get a government in place that in the abstract recognizes the need to compromise. Now, getting them to actually compromise and to actually function is going to take some time. And it's a lot tougher to do now than it might have been back in 2006 or 2008, 2009, 2010. So
I think it's important.
We've lost a big chunk of time here.
I think it's important the way you're challenging them. The debate always tends to be about us, that everything that happens there is either because Barack Obama did or did not do something. And they actually have agency.
Well, this is something that the American people, I think, innately understand. Sometimes Washington doesn't understand. We are the sole superpower in the world, and we remain the one indispensable nation. There's no issue in which our leadership is not critical. But what the American people get, what our military understands, what anybody who's involved in these problems recognizes is that we cannot do for them what they are unwilling to do for themselves. We can do it temporarily. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what the U.S. military did after 2006, 2007 in Iraq. Our military is so capable that if we put everything we have into it, we can keep a lid on a problem for a time. Mm-hmm. But for a society to function long term, the people themselves have to make decisions about how they're going to live together, how they're going to accommodate each other's interests, how they're going to compromise. When it comes to things like corruption, the people and their leaders have to hold themselves accountable for changing those cultures. When it comes to making investments in education and the next generation, they've got to decide this is more important than a Swiss bank account or more important than some big status building that they want to build. Those are all decisions that folks have to make. What we can do is to present to them a vision that would allow them to succeed. We can help them and partner with them every step of the way, but we can't do it for them.
Yeah, there's a tendency there to say, I'm strong, why should I compromise? Yeah. I'm weak, how can I compromise? And it tends to oscillate. You never kind of get that middle ground.
That's exactly right.
On Iraq, two questions. One is, what triggered yesterday? What happened in your own mind yesterday that said, I've got to act in a different way, involve the military, number one. And number two, one thing that struck me in your speech last night was that you framed the argument for intervening in purely humanitarian grounds. And that I wondered why you didn't anchor it, that connect force with a political outcome. I mean it in this sense, that it seems to me Kurdistan is actually exactly the kind of entity that is building a pluralistic, decent, they're not pure democracy yet, but tending in the right direction. Yeah. And that I think we're justified in using force to protect that and also signaling everyone in the neighborhood, this is the kind of thing we want to protect.
Well, a couple of things I'd say. First of all, what I announced yesterday is actually an extension of what I said back in June when ISIL started on the march and entered into Mosul, which was I, as Commander-in-Chief, will always do what's necessary to protect our men and women around the world. And I've been very clear about the fact that we've got an embassy in Baghdad, we've got a consulate in Erbil, and we've got to make sure that they're not threatened. Which means that part of the rationale for my announcement yesterday was an encroachment close enough to Erbil that it would justify us taking shots, just for pure protection of U.S. personnel and facilities. With respect to the Sinjar and the poor men, women, and children who are trapped on top of that mountain, I've always said that we can't solve every problem, but when you have a unique circumstance in which genocide is threatened and a country is willing to have us in there, you have a strong international consensus that these people need to be protected, and we have a capacity to do so, then we have an obligation to do so. The point you make about the broader strategic concern, how do we push back on ISIL, but also how do we preserve a space for the best impulses inside of Iraq, that very much is on my mind. That has been on my mind throughout. I do think the Kurds used that time that was given by our troop sacrifices in Iraq. They used that time well. And the Kurdish region is functional the way we would like to see it. And it is tolerant of other sects and other religions in a way that we'd like to see elsewhere. So we do think that it's important to make sure that that space is protected. But more broadly, what I've indicated is that I don't want to get in the business of being the Iraqi Air Force. I don't want to get in the business of, for that matter, even being the Kurdish Air Force in the absence of a commitment of the people on the ground to get their act together and do what's necessary politically to start protecting themselves and to push back against ISIL. So the reason that we did not, for example, just start taking a bunch of airstrikes all across Iraq as soon as ISIL came in was because that would have taken the pressure off Maliki, that would have taken the pressure off Baghdad. The thinking would be, you know what, we don't actually have to make compromises, we don't have to make any decisions, we don't have to go through the difficult process of figuring out what we've done wrong in the past. All we have to do is let the Americans bail us out again, and we continue to go about business as usual. And what I've been saying to every faction within Iraq is, we will be your partners, but we are not going to do it for you. We're not sending a bunch of U.S. troops back on the ground to keep a lid on things. You are going to have to show us that you are willing and ready to try to maintain a unified Iraqi government that is based on compromise, that you are willing to continue to build a non-sectarian, functional security force that is answerable to a civilian government. You do that, and then you've got a strong partner with us. And we do have a strategic interest in pushing back ISIL. We're not going to let them create some caliphate through Syria and Iraq, but we can only do that if we know that we've got partners on the ground who are capable of filling the void. We can run them off for a certain period of time, but as soon as our planes are gone, they're coming right back in. And so if we're going to reach out to Sunni tribes, if we're going to reach out to local governors and leaders, they've got to have some sense that they're fighting for something. And as horrible as ISIL is, we should be able to provide them some inducement to peel them away, but not if we continue to see the same kinds of dysfunction in Baghdad that we've been seeing for too many years.
Mr. President, are you worried about Israel today? Do you worry about Israel's long-term survivability? I've been there for the last months, last week, but watching the war. What does it feel like to you?
Well, it is amazing to see what Israel has become over the last several decades. I mean, you think about the dream of the early Zionists, and to have scratched out of rock this incredibly vibrant, incredibly successful and wealthy and powerful country is a testament to the ingenuity and the energy and vision of the Jewish people. And because Israel is so capable militarily, I don't worry about Israel's survival. Mm-hmm. Others can cause Israel pain. Yeah. It's a really bad neighborhood, and they can inflict casualties and destruction in parts of Israel. But Israel's going to survive. That's not the issue. I think the question really is how does Israel survive, and how can you create a state of Israel that maintains its democratic and civic traditions? How can you preserve a Jewish state that is also reflective of the best values of those who founded Israel? And in order to do that, it has consistently been my belief that you have to find a way to live side by side in peace with Palestinians. You have to recognize their interests. You have to recognize that they have legitimate claims, and this is their land and neighborhood as well. And so, this is why we have worked so hard against the advice of realists who've said you're wasting your time, to try to move the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government closer and closer together to an agreement on a two-state solution. And I will tell you that at this point the problems are not technical. I mean, they're difficult challenges. You know, how does Israel make sure that it is secure from the Jordan Valley on in? Anybody who's been to Jerusalem understands that how proximate the West Bank is to Jewish population centers, and you know, in today's world with the kind of weaponry that's available, you know, it's understandable that Israel needs to have a lot of confidence in the security system if we had an independent West Bank. But I sent one of our top generals, General Allen, who had been the commander of coalition forces in Afghanistan, and he spent a lot of time working with Israelis and asking them about their security needs in their own terms, not telling them what they needed, but saying, okay, what is it that you need, and let's find some solutions, and solutions are obtainable. The challenge now is political. It's a question of will. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that he believes in a two-state solution, and Bibi has said that he wants to help bring that about. When it comes to nitty-gritty, though, the politics in Israel has shifted pretty heavily towards the right. The settler movement coming out of Israel, I think, has made it much more difficult to shape a serious compromise. On the Palestinian side, I think Abu Mazen is genuine in his belief in a two-state solution and peace. He has recognized Israel. If you look at the performance of security forces in the Palestinian Authority and their cooperation with IDF, they have performed pretty admirably. But he has also been unwilling to seize the moment all too often. And so there's this constant nickel and diming that goes back and forth between what should be allies, because the enemy of Israel is not the Palestinian Authority. The enemy is those like Hamas who have a nihilistic view. Conversely, the enemy of Abu Mazen is not Israel. It's those same nihilists who want to undermine any kind of moderate, reasonable, modern vision of what a Palestinian state might look like. But they can't bridge the gap of trust. And obviously the situation in Gaza has made it worse, not better. What I worry about right now is in the absence of a serious belief in a two-state solution, that the Palestinians start losing hope. And when they start losing hope, then the prospects for growing extremism or violence is of significant concern. And what is also true, last point I would make, is that the way that Hamas has completely distorted the possibilities of Gaza. You've written about this. The notion that they can spend incredible resources and engineering on tunnels.
I mean, the craftsmanship is amazing.
Instead of focusing on building schools and roads and doing some of the things that the Kurds, for example, were able to do, even though they did not have the autonomy that they might have wanted, is a disaster. Their willingness to embed rocket launchers in population centers, knowing that by then firing those rockets, they're inviting retaliation that can end up killing their own people, is appalling. So I have no sympathy for Hamas, but as I said at a press conference a couple of days ago, I have great sympathy for the ordinary person in Gaza that really does feel trapped. Not just caught in the crossfire, but even when it's quiet, basically doesn't have the capacity to fulfill their ambitions because they are penned in and restricted.
So is it time maybe for you to basically bring them both here and say, historically, Israelis and Palestinians have kind of needed the American president to play the heavy, to be able to go to their cabinet and say, I would never do this. But that Obama, that guy, that son of a, he made, I would never do this. But he made me. Is it time for you to play the heavy?
Well, we have been doing that behind the scenes. I've had some pretty tense conversations with both sides throughout this process. But going back to something earlier that we talked about, you can lead folks to water. They've got to drink. And so far, at least, they haven't been willing to, in part because the politics in their societies are working in opposite directions. Prime Minister Netanyahu's poll numbers are a lot higher than mine. We're greatly boosted by the war in Gaza. And so if he doesn't feel some internal pressure, then it's hard to see him being willing to make some very difficult compromises, including taking on the settler movement. That's a tough thing to do. With respect to Abbas, it's a slightly different problem. In some ways, Bibi's too strong. In some ways, Abbas is too weak to bring them together and make the kinds of bold decisions that a Sadat or Begin or Rabin were willing to make.
It goes back to what you said. If you look at the Middle East, all the successful political arrangements always were no victor, no vanquished.
That's exactly right.
Ultimately.
And right now, you don't see that dynamic. So we're going to continue to push. But I think that it's going to require leadership among both the Palestinians and the Israelis to look beyond tomorrow or next year or even 5 years from now and look at 20 years from now. And that's the hardest thing for politicians to do, is to take the long view on things.
Speaking of someone whose poll numbers are, in my view, tragically up, Vladimir Putin.
Right.
Two questions, Mr. President. Did something snap with him? And I don't say that glibly. I oppose NATO expansion. I oppose NATO expansion because I believe that there was no problem in the world we could solve without Russia. And we've seen that on Iran. We've seen it on Syria. And I know part of this is payback for that. But we made a terrible trade. We traded Russia for the Czech Navy. It was a really, I think, it was before your time, but it was a bad trade. Nevertheless, we are where we are. Is it time, again, maybe for you and Merkel to sit down with him and just say, look, Vladimir, we need you. We're ready to build you a ladder, not to give you Ukraine, but is there some place you can go only because to try to manage the Middle East now? When you think of the help he's gotten with on Iran and Syria, giving you, is there any way out of this?
A couple observations I'd make. First of all, we had a very productive relationship with Russia in my first term, when President Medvedev was primarily serving as the face of Russian diplomacy, and Prime Minister Putin was still behind the scenes, obviously, as the key power in the country. And we were able to make some very significant progress. If you look back at what happened, when Putin decided to run again for the presidency, for the first time he was challenged politically. And we started seeing this anti-American and anti-Western sentiment and sort of the proto-Russian nationalist, almost czarist, attitude as early as his campaign, because you'll recall there were protests in the streets where and thousands of people were gathering, and it seemed as if, I think, from his perspective, he was losing control, and it proved successful for him politically, and so he kept playing that game. I think he does have genuine concerns about not just NATO expansion, but also missile defense, our unilateral pullout of the ABM treaty, our decision to first go into Iraq. I think he views our decision internationally to work with a coalition to go into Libya, all as examples of the U.S. throwing its weight around in ways that are contrary to Russian interests. And some of those, I think he can make a rational argument, although I disagree with him. But I actually think that the situation in Ukraine caught him by surprise. This wasn't some grand strategy. What happened was that his crony, Yanukovych, was so corrupt and had made promises to sign a European agreement, then had to go back on it. Yeah. Suddenly you've got these protests in Ukraine, people saying, look at Poland, we were at the same place as they were 20 years ago, and now suddenly they've shot up into a genuinely prosperous European country, and we're still stuck with this kleptocracy. And I actually spoke to Putin and tried to broker an agreement that would quell the violence, allow Yanukovych to play out his term, but would devolve power to the Rada. And Yanukovych took off because what he realized was, well, if suddenly the parliament has more power, they may start looking into the stuff that I've been doing. And Putin, I think, caught flat-footed on that, improvised himself into Crimea, and now what you've seen is a smaller and smaller circle around him. Fierce Russian nationalists suddenly having his ear. The escalation of Russian state media cranking up this jingoism. And I'm not sure that this was all planned, but he now finds himself in a place where his poll numbers are very high. He's stirred Russians into a frenzy. The majority of them actually believe that the Ukrainians, for example, shot down the Malaysian Airlines plane. And so finding an off-ramp for him becomes more challenging. Having said that, I think it is still possible for us, because of the effective organization that we've done with the Europeans around Ukraine, and the genuine bite that the sanctions have had on the Russian economy, for us to arrive at a fair accommodation in which Ukrainian sovereignty and independence is still recognized. But there is also recognition that Ukraine does have historic ties to Russia. The majority of their trade goes to Russia. Huge portions of the population are Russian-speaking. And so they're not going to be severed from Russia. And if we do that...
A deal is possible.
A deal should be possible. Yeah. But one of the things that I have discovered during the course of my presidency is just because something makes sense doesn't mean it actually happens. That's true domestically and in foreign policy. And so... I think we are at a dangerous time, in part because the position of the separatists has weakened. I think Putin does not want to lose face. And so the window for arriving at that compromise continues to
He could invade. I mean,
he could invade. And if he does, that will, I think, set us on a course, not to a new Cold War, but trying to find our way back to a cooperative, functioning relationship with Russia during the remainder of my term will be much more difficult.
What's the biggest thing you've learned doing foreign policy? Ariel Sharon once said there were things I could see from here that I couldn't see from there when he became prime minister. Yeah. What's the biggest takeaway for you? Well,
there are a couple of things. I think that what we've done well, and what I push my team now to build on, is recognizing not just problems but also opportunities. The Africa Summit that we just had didn't get a lot of coverage here. It was dominated by the Ebola scare. But we had 50 countries show up, and wasn't a lot of posturing, wasn't a lot of stock speeches. You had a continent that 20 years ago was perceived as falling off a cliff, that now has 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies because of the work that not just my administration, but the Bush administration, Clinton administration have done, along with our international partners and the countries themselves. Drastically cut HIV/AIDS, drastically cut tuberculosis and malaria, You are seeing a growing middle class. When you travel around Africa, the interest not in aid but in markets and reform and private sector investment is remarkable. And what we now are seeing is that we are as well positioned as any country, including China, which has made a lot of investments primarily because they want to get natural resources out of Africa. We are positioned better than anybody to really partner with a young, vibrant continent that has huge geopolitical implications. The same with our pivot to Asia. A lot of people have questioned, well, what does this really mean concretely? Is this just for show? But the truth of the matter is we've been showing up in Asia in a way that we hadn't done for a decade. And now our alliances with traditional allies like Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, those alliances have never been stronger. We have a deeper relationship with the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia than we ever have before. They are wanting us to be in there much more heavily than before. And as a consequence, there are great commercial opportunities as well as strategic possibilities there that didn't exist. Same is true in Latin America, where you remember when I came into office, you had Chavez. The thinking was that was the future of Latin America. That's all been pushed aside. And it's now countries like Chile and Peru and even a country like Colombia that had so many problems that is now on the move, and they want relationships with us. So I guess the point is that we've been looking at opportunities even as we're trying to manage problems. I have learned, however, that, and this is just a lesson that I think American presidents have to learn over and over and over again, is that when we intervene militarily, there are unintended consequences. Sometimes it's necessary for us to do it, but we have to think those consequences through. I'll give you an example of a lesson I had to learn that still has ramifications to this day, and that is our participation in the coalition that overthrew Gaddafi in Libya. I absolutely believe that it was the right thing to do. When people say, look at the chaos, should have let Gaddafi stay there, they forget that the Arab Spring had come full force to Libya, and had we not intervened, it's likely that Libya would be Syria, right? Because Gaddafi was not going to be able to contain what had been unleashed there, and so there'd be more death, more disruption, more destruction. But what is also true is that I think we underestimated, our European partners underestimated the need to come in full force. If you're going to do this, then it's the day after Gaddafi's gone, when everybody's feeling good and everybody's holding up posters saying, "Thank you, America." At that moment, there has to be a much more aggressive effort to rebuild societies that didn't have any civic traditions, right? You've had a despot for 40 years in place. There are no traditions there to build on, unlike Tunisia, where there was a civil society, and that's why they've been more successful in transitioning. So that's a lesson that I now apply every time I ask the question, should we intervene militarily? Do we have an answer the day after?
Is that boots on the ground, or is that...
That's I think, across the board. I mean, there are going to be certain discrete moments where you say, this is going to be clean, and we can get something done. But on a big project that involves a society in complete turmoil, we have an obligation to think it through. The last thing I've learned, and I suspect we're running out of time, so I want to make sure I get this in, is how we as Americans have, I think, a valuable trait, which is self-doubt. And so every so often we wonder, are we in decline? What's happening to American leadership? We're being overtaken by somebody, whether it's the Russians or the Japanese or the Chinese. You go around the world, things don't run unless we're there. You go to a multilateral forum, we set the agenda. You look at any particular project on health, on education, on energy, you name it. Everybody's looking to us in terms of, okay, how should we make this work? Sometimes people resent it. Sometimes folks will resist it because of their own self-interest. But the thing that I'd like Americans to recognize, to understand, is that we have the best cards. And if you look at where we were when I came into office and where we are now, not only have we seen improvement on every economic index, but there are key shifts in, for example, energy that are game changers. I mean, we're the only major power in the world that, other than Russia, but economically Russia I don't consider a major power, but we're the only ones who genuinely are about as close to energy independent as you can be for an economy of our size and wealth. What we've done on clean energy, where you're starting to, we've increased wind power by threefold, solar power tenfold, means that we have the opportunity to lead in places that every country envies. Our ability to train people at our universities and our community colleges is still unparalleled. Our immigration system, if it would get fixed, remains an envy of the world because we still attract the best and the brightest. I mean, when people tell me that we have to worry about Russia, I try to remind them long term, nobody's trying to immigrate to Moscow. Nobody thinks that's the place of opportunity where, if I've got a good idea, I'm going to be able to make something happen. They want to go to Silicon Valley. They want to go to one of our leading universities to do their research and to get things going. And so the biggest impediment to American leadership is not external. We are the strongest military. We have the most dynamic economy. What is going to be the measure of success in the 21st century is all our stuff. It's all knowledge. It's all innovation. It's all openness. It's all ability to blend cultures. This is all our thing. It's empowering individuals. The thing that's going to hold us back is going to be us. And if we make good decisions, then we will continue to be not only the dominant power, but a benevolent force around the world.
Are we making good decisions, though? Because I feel when I look at Washington from abroad,
Yeah.
I look. It feels like we kick around this country like it's a football, and it's not a football. It's actually a Fabergé egg. I mean, we can drop it, we can break it. I mean, enough dysfunction on all these core issues that you've talked about, and that's what I worry about, because I feel so many times we're saying to the world, do as we say, not as we do, not like we used to.
Yeah, I would distinguish between American society and American politics. I mean, the truth is that countries should continue to do as we do in looking at how our private sector operates in many ways, how our universities operate, how our communities and our nonprofits operate. We still set a pretty darn good example. You think, for all our problems, how the American people responded after 9/11. And I give somebody like President Bush enormous credit for this. There wasn't suddenly this huge surge of anti-Muslim sentiment in this country. There were problems sporadically, but overwhelmingly people had to say, you know what, those are Americans. Yeah. And our tradition is we don't make distinctions like that. So the health of American society I don't worry about too much. I worry about sometimes our eating habits and watching too much TV maybe. overall, I think we're in a pretty good place. Our politics are dysfunctional. And something that I said earlier serves as a warning to us. And that is, societies don't work if political factions take maximalist positions. And the more diverse the country is, the less it can afford to take maximalist positions. One of the great benefits of America has been that we're not ideological. We're not utopian. We're visionary, we're optimistic, but we're also practical.
No victor, no vanquished
right.
At the end of the day is how we got here.
And what you've seen in terms of our politics, partly because of gerrymandering, partly because of the Balkanization of the media, so people just watch what reinforces their deepest biases, partly because of big money in politics, is increasingly politicians are rewarded for taking the most extreme maximalist positions. And sooner or later that catches up with you. And you end up not being able to move forward on things we need to move forward on. We need to reform our immigration system. That would be good not just for our domestic economy, but for our position in the world. You travel around Latin America, nothing would more reinforce an admiration for the United States than us doing that. We need to rebuild our infrastructure. You go to the Singapore airport, and then you come back to one of our airports, and you say, we're not acting like a superpower.
It's like going from the Jetsons to the Flintstones.
Exactly. We need to revamp our education system, K through 12 in particular. You look at what Finland's doing with its kids, and you look at what we're doing with our kids, and you say, we're falling short. And all these things are doable. And our fiscal position actually now is such, deficit's been cut by more than half, where we're in a position to make some smart investments that have huge payoffs that historically have not been controversial, historically have garnered bipartisan support, but because of this maximalist ideological position, we've been blocked. And I have to say here, I've been speaking in generalities and trying not to be too political, but that ideological extremism and maximalist position is much more prominent right now in the Republican Party than the Democrats. Democrats have problems, but overall, if you look at the Democratic consensus, it's a pretty common sense mainstream consensus. It's not a lot of wacky ideological nonsense, and by the way, it generally is fact-based and reason-based. We're not denying science, we're not denying climate change, we're not pretending that somehow having a whole bunch of uninsured people is the American way. We're doing things that are pretty sensible, and I'm optimistic that these things go in cycles, and that the Republican Party eventually will free itself from the grip of this kind of extremist ideology. But it's necessary to happen soon.
Mr. President, before we leave, I want to talk about Iran for a second, because if there's a game changer in the Middle East, it seems to me if we could somehow end the Iran-U.S. Cold War that has so distorted the region, but that requires the Iranian leadership, it seems to me, to forego a policy that says our hostility to America is just central to our ability to rule here. In the negotiations in Vienna, are you seeing any hope? Do you have any hope that these could actually produce the kind of accord that maybe could open other avenues of collaboration?
There's no doubt the opportunity is there. Whether we can get it done, I'd still put it at a little less than 50-50. But the logic of it is compelling. Look, we're a very different society than Iran. I think the supreme leader of Iran has a very different worldview, it's fair to say, than I do.
Yeah.
The state sponsorship by Iran of terrorist organizations like Hezbollah means we should be very suspicious of how they operate regionally. But if you look at the logic of getting a nuclear deal done, where they give up the pursuit of nuclear weapons, but still have some capacity for nuclear power, which is what they say they want. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Leader himself has forsworn ever developing nuclear weapons. Well, if that's the case, we can come up with a formula where they have some modest enrichment capabilities that are used for domestic purposes, for peaceful purposes. And in return, suddenly their economy opens up, and they're a big, sophisticated country with a lot of talent. Yeah. And the degree to which they could then grow and naturally assume leadership in the region alongside other countries, rather than depend on trying to undermine other countries for leadership. If I'm Iran, I'd be a lot more confident and look around and say to myself, you know what, in this neighborhood, we could have the strongest economy, we could have the best innovation, and we don't need nuclear weapons. We'd be better off if we can open this thing up, and there's more trade and commerce and exchange of ideas, all that. Now, the problem is obviously that threatens certain interests inside of Iran. Yeah. Right? So the reason that this may not happen is if the IRGC or certain mullahs inside of Iran say, you start opening things up and suddenly our grip on power weakens and new ideas come in. And so maybe we don't want that. That may prevent us from getting a deal done. On our side, I think it's important to recognize that the kind of deal we're structuring involves having absolute verification that they cannot develop breakout capacity. And if we're able to attain that without resort to military force, that's greatly preferable. The only way you can really prevent a country from getting nuclear weapons ultimately is because they decide not to do it in today's knowledge. Yeah. The knowledge is there, and the resources of even a country as dysfunctional and poor as North Korea. Let's put it this way. If North Korea can get a nuclear weapon, there's no country that can't get it, because they can't even feed their people, but if they're determined enough, they can get it. So we can take military action that slows that effort, but our best bet is to actually get an agreement. And by the way, that's hugely in our interest, particularly in this environment, because we don't want to see a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. That's dangerous, and the proliferation dangers are obviously clear. So what we've got to do is to find a formula in which Iran not only has a modest enrichment capacity to serve peaceful domestic purposes, that we can verify doesn't provide them with breakout capacity, and that is scaled over time so that the sanctions don't all immediately drop off. But step by step, as we gain more confidence, they gain more confidence as well. It's there to be had. Whether ultimately Iran can seize that opportunity, we'll have to wait and see. But it's not for lack of trying on our part.
As I listened to you last night, everyone's saying, "What's President Obama going to do? What's Obama going to do?" China today is the biggest energy investor in Iraq. At some point, do you say to them or want to say to them, it's time you become a stakeholder in this system, and not a free rider?
I do say that to them, and they do. They are free riders, and then they've been free riders for the last 30 years, and it's worked really well for them. Yeah. And I've joked sometimes when my inbox starts stacking up. I said, "Can't we be a little more like China?" Nobody ever seems to expect them to do anything when this stuff comes up. But it's for that same reason that I think people look to America in ways that they don't look to China. They recognize that, in the annals of human history, it's been pretty rare for a superpower to, yes, act in its own self-interest, yes, occasionally make mistakes, yes, think in terms of what's in it for us, but also, more often than any time in human history, a big superpower saying, you know what, what's in it for everybody? How does this help other people? How should we act in a way that is reflective of our values? And that's not how the Chinese operate. Now, that's a disadvantage for us in many ways, but it's also an advantage, and it's the reason why we're exceptional and why I'm glad I'm the President of the United States of America.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Mr.
You
President.
bet.
Really appreciate it.
Enjoyed it.
Really enjoyed it.